there are tens of thousands of consumer goods that incorporate these forever chemicals. The other term that you hear a lot besides PFAS is forever chemicals, because once you make them, they don't come apart in nature essentially at all. Not in the sun, not in the water, not due to bugs, not due to anything.
PFAS, PFOAs, there's 10 to 15,000. We don't even know, but there's a lot. And they're used in virtually from flame retardants, the mattresses. When you hear things like stain resistant or waterproofing, even in mascara, even like run from it.
These compounds are bioaccumulative, which means if you get exposed to a little bit every day, it stays in your body.
Welcome to SuperLife with me, Darren Oline, a podcast where we explore, discover, and share solutions that promote a healthier life and a better world. Together, we'll ignite possibilities, inspire change, and build sovereignty, creating a roadmap towards a super life for you and for all. Get ready to start living your super life.
Officially welcome to the show, Kris Hansen. We we had a previous conversation that we thought was recorded, but realized it wasn't. But this is going to be even the best ever. So this is something that I was really inspired by your work. I was inspired by. I'm so grateful that the New Yorker put out that article. And like I said before, the work that you didn't realize you were starting to do way back in the 90s. And we share, of course, I just got to tell the audience that we share the love of Minnesota, and you're from there, or you're currently there, you're from there, and I'm from there. So there's also a kind of a deeper meaning in that sense too, because the headquarters of 3M is there, and also we'll give some cool solution-based things at the end of the episode. I think that will be helpful. So I want people to understand we're going to be diving into some very interesting and kind of intense stuff, but I want everyone to understand that there's some good people out there doing some good things, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So welcome to the show, Kris.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So everyone who hasn't read the article, why don't you just recap the mid 90s as maybe describe your career, your PhD and your expertise, and then kind of that first happenings in the 3M plant.
All right. I got my PhD at the University of Colorado, and the work that I did was looking for very low levels of compounds in the air in cities that cause air pollution and breathing problems. So I had a good background in looking for very low levels of a certain kind of compounds, taking them out of the air in that case and putting them into an analytical instrument to understand what they were and how much of them there were. And that set me up pretty well for fitting in at the environmental lab within 3M, doing that same kind of work, although not looking in the air, and looking often specifically for fluorochemicals when I started in places where they should be, and just trying to understand a little bit more about them. And fluorochemicals were manufactured primarily by 3M in the US. So that's why they had a lot of interest in those compounds.
Right. So let's just off the start here, let's describe what they are, because now I don't know if it's me, but I think I wrote a book on it. Not specifically on that, but it was in a chapter, and I talked about it, and it was so shocking to really start looking and researching and writing and reading and having researchers work with me, and even more so now having gotten to know you a little bit and hearing your story. It's rightly very scary, and so describe to us maybe a little about and maybe we can go into the origin story, but first let's just set up what these fluorine, carbon, kind of radical molecules are, and then maybe describe why they're so damn good at their job.
Sure. So fluorochemicals, now the word that you hear most often is PFAS, which is polyfluorinated alkyl substances. So you can see why we give it a nice short acronym. Basically, there's not a lot of carbon-fluorine bonds that exist in nature, but humanity has figured out how to overcome that with a pretty nasty process, one of which is called electrochemical fluorination, but you can put a lot of energy into a system and attach fluorine to carbon molecules. And maybe it should be obvious because they're not found in nature. It's pretty hard to do that, and it's pretty hard to undo it. And so the other term that you hear a lot besides PFAS is forever chemicals, because once you make them, they don't come apart in nature essentially at all. Not in the sun, not in the water, not due to bugs, not due to anything. So forever chemicals as they are. When they're being manufactured for products, they're manufactured in such a way that they can have some characteristics that make them useful. In the case of one of 3M's most notorious fluorochemicals, it's what's called a surfactant. And so a surfactant is just another word for a kind of a soap, but it works. Those compounds work really well for things like waterproofing garments, for keeping things from sticking to things, from making things flow easier. And although they maybe started off with some very discrete uses in things like the product Scotch Guard, for example, they just got more and more popular. And so now there are tens of thousands of consumer goods that incorporate these forever chemicals.
Yeah, and just to unpack that, just so people can understand, like I don't want people to just hear forever chemicals. I really want people to sit on that for a second. Like this is forever. Like and listen, at the end, I was on a discussion actually last night with a good friend of mine who's a wickedly smart individual. And we were discussing stuff like that, where he's like, I think heat and pressure and maybe some frequency, and he's played with weird frequencies and magnetics, and he's kind of now got it in his head to maybe through temperature and pressure and some system that's not in nature, and that's the most important thing, that maybe we can break those apart in a certain way. But again, it's like biologically, like there's at least no answer to this period, and they're bioaccumulating, and they're also accumulating environmentally, and so that's where it really starts to set the alarms, and again, to say like that the quintessential muse of it all is that nonstick pan. And it's that heat resistant. It's that, and in clothing, it's all over now in clothing. We tested, I think I told you last time, we tested a garment, airline stewardess garment, that of course, how convenient to not have stain resistant on that. But the levels were 10 times the amount of what they even deemed as a safe amount, which you and I both know there is no safe amount. So, and I got to be in that lab doing the fluorine precipitation test, and it was like, wow, like pretty shocking when you're firsthand. And that's what I love about talking with you, because you're almost, you were in the front line, and this was what, 96, 97, right? 1996, 97 ish, where you're at the front line. So now that we've established people that PFAS, PFOAs, there's 10 to 15,000, we don't even know, but there's a lot, and they're used in virtually from flame retardants to like you said, the flow agents around that, the mattresses, so when you hear things like stain resistant or waterproofing, even in mascara, even like run from it, right? So anyway, I just want to establish that so people understand now to be on the lookout for some of those things. So now, kind of back to your story. So now you come into 3M with a certain specific pedigree. I guess what how, because I want to accelerate to that point where why the hell did they decide to test people's, at least the workers' blood, like where did that happen? But maybe set up like what your work initially started as and where it kind of went.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said a really useful point in your summary, and that's that these compounds are bioaccumulative, which means if you get exposed to a little bit every day, it stays in your body. So that's how the workers kind of became a population that were of interest, because these are folks that were working with their hands producing these compounds every day. And at some point, they decided they needed to start monitoring the level of these compounds in the workers' blood. And they were extraordinarily high, as you would expect, because again, they're getting exposed every day and their body is retaining them. And so that's kind of where my story starts, is just in the routine analysis of some worker blood. My boss had sent those samples out to another lab, a non-3M lab, and asked them to do the analysis. And so they started to work with the method and came back and said, there is something interfering with our ability to look at the level of PFAS, which is a specific PFAS molecule, in the worker's blood. And so my boss came to me and said, they said that there is a contaminant, and can you figure out what it is? And this contract lab was, because they wanted to have a clean sample to compare to the exposed workers, they had gotten some blood from the Red Cross that they had purchased. So blood just collected from the general population. And it was in that blood of the general population that they found what they called a contaminant, and or an interferent to the method, actually. And so that's where I started to do my investigation.
So you're getting a huge amount of tests, and so were they trying to create a baseline, saying,
Exactly.
they're trying to create some sort of control based on this incoming blood for them to test, but they were getting interference from something that they didn't know, and was that interference literally the same thing that was in the blood? So it was essentially the interference was that the PFAS was already in the quote unquote supposed to be controlled blood that was outside of and absolutely not connected to 3M or a worker. Is that right?
That is. You gave away the suspenseful ending. So yeah, so I dug into this interferent, and spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was, and developed a new, more sensitive method, and understood eventually that the thing that was causing the interference in the blood that we had purchased from the blood bank was PFOS itself. And we did a lot of work then to make sure that we were right. We looked at any material that might have touched the blood and accidentally put this fluorochemical in it, and we cleaned the lab and the machine, but eventually it was pretty clear that we had found this 3M fluorochemical in the blood of the general population, and that was, a big and scary moment.
Jesus. I mean, the fact that someone finally kind of puts it together, like, hey, let's see what the levels are in our own workers. And then the fact that in the control, they can't even find you can't find a sample that doesn't. So I mean, that that has got to be one of the scariest moments for, I mean, as a general person in the company, like, who doesn't, I don't know, it to me, it's like, holy shit, we contaminated people without our knowledge, or in this case, maybe there was knowledge. Like, so then from there, where did you just continue to test blood? And from that point, like, what was the directive of 3M?
So I did. When I had convinced myself that it was PFOS, I showed my boss that data, and I had a printout that showed very clearly that it was PFOS that was in the blood of the general population. And he took that data and he went into his office and shut the door and didn't come out for the rest of the day. And I knew it was a big deal, but I guess I was expecting him to come out and give me some kind of feedback, but he didn't. And very soon after that, he took early retirement and left the company. So it was kind of a funny situation to be holding this extremely stressful and very significant piece of data, and to have my boss, my mentor, my champion leave the company. And so that initiated a very stressful period of uncertainty for me as a new scientist, as a young scientist, and as a woman scientist within that corporation.
Wow. So did he ever explain to you? Have you been in contact with, like, what happened?
No, I mean, he left the company. He didn't give me any explanation, I guess, early retirement. And I didn't question him about it. And I haven't spoken to him since the day that he walked out the door from 3M in, 1997, I guess it was. I know now, thanks to Sharon Lerner, who's the journalist that authored the article in the New Yorker, that he claims he knew exactly what it was. And he claims that he wasn't interested in hanging around for the aftermath of having that information proven. So, she shared that in her article. She shared that with me, but that was a revelation to me for sure.
So he saw the writing on the wall.
That's what he says.
Yeah, that's what he says. Or, who knows what really happened, because if he revealed something and then revealed that to his superiors. So at that point, though, the obvious question is, you're finding this and you're continuing to test this blood. But where is the safety data at that point? So, okay, you find something in the blood, but what does that mean? Does that mean that it's going to kill people? Does that mean that? So where are you at in that part of it? Like, because they've been creating this since what you can arguably say, 50s, 60s?
50s, yeah, mid 50s, I think. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and for me, honestly, it was overwhelming because I was getting, first there was some questions about the data, and then the questions shifted to be about me. And, I was a bad chemist. I had a big ego. I wanted attention. I was sloppy, everything that you can imagine. And my team and I just kept on collecting data, analyzing blood samples wherever they came from to try and characterize how widespread this was. And yeah, it was against a backdrop of the company saying, you're wrong, something is wrong with you. However, even if you are right, there's nothing to worry about because we have all this data on our workers and they have higher levels than you found in the general population, or that you claim to have found in the general population. So really, from my standpoint, the the criticism and the skepticism about me over this finding continued until we analyzed some blood samples that had been archived. They had been collected from recruits for the Korean War back in the early 1950s, before 3M had commercialized fluorochemical-based products. And that set of samples was the first data set that we analyzed where we didn't detect any fluorochemicals. And it was pretty hard to argue with our conclusion at that point that every blood sample subsequent to the launch of 3M's fluorochemical products had fluorochemicals in it, but the ones before the launch did not.
Whoa. And so there's multiple lines going on right now. There's this bombshell of data that's growing in impossibility to deny. And then the only other thing is these early forms of gaslighting you. So making it personal to you. I brought up last time my good friend Robin O'Brien, when she started outing the food, ultra processed food industry for creating all this stuff. She got gaslit big time, 12 years ago. So it's like, so now you're this proficient woman that is dropping one of the biggest bombs within the company. And they turn their attention towards not the data, but to you. But then you just keep going, which I love, right? You and the team keep going. And I can imagine then that once you find that blood creation of that, or at least in the general population, you find there's got to be a little retribution to you, and there's got to that has to be kind of almost a beautiful silver lining, right? To then not question yourself and go, no, this is true by finding a clean sample. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean that day when I saw the data set without the fluorochemicals in it, and I recognized that should put the doubters to rest. I mean, I was ecstatic. I called my husband and shared the news with him. I won't say that there was a noticeable change inside 3M in response to that. It was still, there was still a lot of stress. There seemed to me still a lot of resentment over what I was doing. But at least now people couldn't, say I was a bad scientist, because the data seemed pretty irrefutable at that point.
Right. So then the other thing is, so they're saying this almost narrative going, okay, well, even if you have found this, that's fine, because we already have information that there's nothing wrong with this anyway. And so, number one, did they have anything? Number two, are you just trusting that? And I would imagine if something was around for that amount of time, you're like, that's a long time. It's a long time to go like, well, so I can understand the benefit of the doubt going, okay, well, I hope they're right. I hope that it's safe. So where was that kind of thought process?
Yeah, in the moment, I definitely bought the line that it wasn't toxic. And in part, I bought it because I'm not a toxicologist and I'm not an epidemiologist. And so when, very senior people at the company, including the most senior medical officers, say it's not toxic, I had plenty of my own problems still, with what I was doing. Right. So I did buy that. What I realize now is that their insistence that it was safe, it really came solely from the work that they had done on their own fluorochemical workers. Like that had been their set of lab rats, if you will, to look for health effects. But really what they were looking for was death as an endpoint and some kinds of cancer. But frankly, it was a very small number of people. It was probably more than 90% men It was a very specific age demographic because it was people who are working in their manufacturing facility. And it was people from, one or two or three geographies in the US. So in terms of deriving any kind of certainty about the health effects, well, that was ridiculous because they were looking at such a narrow population and such a small number of people that an endpoint like cancer would have been really hard to conclude. So I now realize it was ridiculous to say that they knew that it was non-toxic. But at the time, they said it over and over, and I definitely believed it and decided, I have to do my work on finding it and characterizing it and figuring out where it's coming from and leave it to the experts to, articulate what the health effects were.
Yeah, wow. Especially when you're, there's a level of, I think, life, we have a level of naivete, right? We have a level of, like, especially when you have a senior medical officer that's saying it's safe and you're a fellow scientist, really, and you're like, okay, well, they're the authority and they should know, and I'm a fellow scientist, and this is my moral compass of science. And so it's easy to project onto people going, well, they should be operating under a very similar, umbrella of understanding of what science is. So if he's saying that, he's got to have data to support what he's saying, right? That's the kind of the world in which I still have a hard time understanding, right? It is people saying stuff like that and maybe more privately or whatever, but then there's this big hook. And the big hook is, so now so kind of, well, let's finish kind of how it ended there for you. So you continue to test, your team continues to do this. So where do you go now? And who the hell can you, what confidants do you have in the company, and where do you take this now?
Yeah, like you said, we kept collecting data. And so really around the same time we tested those blood samples from the Korean War recruits, we also learned that the PFAS and other fluorochemicals were widespread in the environment and in the food chain. They were in fish, they were in birds. And that was a revelation, almost as significant as understanding how widespread they were in the population, that the entire global food chain was contaminated with these compounds. So that was another huge revelation. And, for me, I like I said, I had a great team, and I had a few other colleagues who were kind of more at my level, who I talked to and who talked to me. But it just seemed like I would share information with management and I never got anything back. And so, in terms of confidants, it was people at my level, very much in the middle of the company. Keep in mind, I was 28 years old at this point, and all of those managers were much older, much farther up the hierarchy than I was. And I just was not getting any direction or affirmation. It really felt like my team and I were pushing things forward, and there was nobody pulling, which was disappointing.
What gave you the data and the information to realize that this was now not just a human blood issue, that it was environmental, it was food chain, it was bioaccumulating in the environment, in the birds, the whales, how did that string kind of happen?
There was kind of two sets of data that clued us in on that. One was we were supporting a toxicology study that was being done on rats to look at the effects of fluorochemicals. And when we analyzed the rats that had not been exposed to fluorochemicals, so again, the control animals, when we looked at the levels of fluorochemical in their liver, expecting to see 0, we actually saw very high levels. And so high, in fact, that they matched the same levels in the lower 2 dose groups in the tox studies. And it took a while to unravel that. But what we eventually learned is that those lab rats were being fed a diet that contained fish meal. The protein component was ground up fish meal. And that fish meal, which was probably from menhaden, which are little fish that were harvested off the east coast of the United States, they had PFOS in them. And that fish meal got incorporated into the rat chow. And so that was one piece of data. And the second was there was another person in the lab who happened to have access to a couple of environmental samples, some levels of some blood samples that had been collected from eaglets. So baby eagles that had never left the nest. And it was a very small amount of blood. But at this point, we were kind of suspicious, and we looked at that and we found that those eagles that had never left the nest had PFOS in their blood. And, their diet is also fish-based, right? Mom and dad go catch fish and bring it back to the nestling.
Oh my God. You're talking like, I mean, the wildest of wild, right? So you're talking about, in this instance, just being as though the eagle is the American symbol. It's catching wild fish, delivering it to its baby, and that bioaccumulation and that baby, that eagle, is full of PFAS.
Before it ever flies.
Yeah. And so now, we're talking 1997. Right?
That was 1998, but yeah.
98,
same thing.
Jesus. And so now you continue to gather this data. Where do you go? You're in your silo. You're doing your thing, which it's kind of astonishing that they didn't just shut you all down, because you just keep doing your thing, right? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, because I was looking for some help on a question, I went to another scientist who I hadn't met before, and I had to drive over to his lab. It was on the other side of the campus, and I went to ask him to help me with something. And before I sat down, he said, "I don't understand why they're making such a big deal about all this fluorochemical stuff. We discovered this 25 years ago." And I mean, that just really knocked the wind out of me. And I sat down and pulled out my notebook and said, what do you mean? And he told me about work that had been done in the mid-1970s that he had done looking at fluorochemicals in human blood that were brought to 3M by some academic researchers. And he had determined that that was PFOS that was in the blood of the general population. That was in 1975. And this was 1998. And, it wasn't, he was just a scientist, right? So he collected the data, and he told me he was told not to share the data. He wasn't a decision maker. And here we were almost 25 years later, and I was rediscovering something that it turns out the corporation had known about all that time.
So he had reported that, he had found that, and he reported it just like you did to 3M, and 3M did nothing.
Yeah, and I think he probably reported it a little bit differently. I think he maybe wasn't quite as much of a pain in the ass about it as I was, but he wrote his report, and he told his boss, and according to what he told me, his boss and the corporate lawyer said, yeah, let's not share this with anybody. So he didn't. and, went back and did his job, which he was very good at, a different kind of analytical chemist. So, yeah, but other than that, I think it was, strikingly similar in terms of what he had discovered and what I had discovered.
So then what was that discussion like? And so even that early comment that he had, so he was also under the at this point the illusion, but really a delusion that it was safe. So he was also just like, okay, I found it, but they told me not to do anything, so I'm a good employee, and I didn't.
Yeah, I think that's about it. For me, hearing his admission was mind-blowing in a really horrible way. Because I think it's one thing to lose track of your compound in the environment. Yeah, it's unforgivable. But then to understand that you actually knew about it and chose to do nothing, that adds a whole nother dimension that I don't know how you come up with a forgivable scenario where you say, I knew about this 25 years ago and I didn't act, and somehow pitch that was the right thing to do. So I, after talking to the scientist, I drove back across town to my lab, and I went immediately to my boss and told him what I had been told. And, like always, his expression didn't change. He just listened to what I had to say, and he asked me to go transcribe my notes and give him a copy. And, that's all he said. That's all I got.
Wow. And you're sitting there going, they have polluted the entire planet.
And they knew about it.
And they knew
did
about
nothing.
And they knew about it for decades and decades and decades and decades. That to me is, there is an unforgivable, horrible thing about that whole thing. And almost the muse of it all is, under any circumstance, we are going to drive profit, and we are going to move profit share. And that's, and then the alarming nature of this plausible deniability, in the sense that if, and that's where was all littered throughout almost every industry I was looking at in my book. It's like, if they don't test it, they're not liable. So they can quote unquote shrug their shoulders. I don't know. It's not on the record. We never tested it. We don't know. It's such a small amount. All of the playbook, but that's where it's like it's completely reversed. Like how these are the questions I ask. How, I can understand how, because they don't care about the same things we care about. They care about the one thing. They're the god of their profit, right? So there's no health and safety proof before a product is put out there, which is so alarming. Like, what's your stance on that? Because it's like, on the one hand, you're testing the stuff and you're believing the chief medical officer, because it doesn't make sense that someone would put something knowingly out in the population without it truly understanding that it's not toxic.
Yeah. I mean, I love your use of the word playbook, because I think that what I've come to understand, no, that's exactly right. And plausible deniability, right? If there's documents that indicate that 3M scientists knew this was going to happen, and even looked at the structure of the fluorochemical and said, we need to test and see if this causes cancer. And they didn't, because it's this phenomenon called undone science, and you just described it yourself, right? If you don't want to know the answer to a question, don't ask the question. So don't do a study to find out if a compound is a carcinogen if you think the answer is it's a carcinogen, because then you have to stop making it, right? And so I do think that that's kind of exactly what happened, is just this not being willing to ask the questions that they guessed what the answer would be. And when they did do studies, they would share half the data. They would share the data that they liked, that supported their narrative, but they didn't share the data that was that challenged the narrative that they wanted to push to keep their profits moving. And in doing that, you're absolutely right. They had plausible deniability that they could say, no, it's okay. We can keep going. There is nothing to worry about here.
I hope people are starting to get that there's a really big rabbit hole here. And it's unfortunately not just the playbook that 3M uses, right? It's a playbook the tobacco industry uses. It's a playbook the pharmaceutical industry uses. It's a playbook big corporations just throw a dart, right? And the frustrating thing for me is when you see, what was it, the PFAS Toxic Control Act was initiated, and you're like, and then they throw a press release, and then you think, you're like, oh, cool, people are going after it. And at the same time, yeah, there's progress, right? So it's not without progress. But at the same time, for me, it's when I see blatant regulatory bodies not regulating, not doing the job that, at least front facing, you think they're supposed to do, and then that they don't do, then you're like, the collusion of this game is so deep now. And at the same time, I will also say, like, there's good scientists like yourself. There's many good people that are asking the important questions, that want to do the right thing. And then at the same time, they're put in positions of, like, you gaslit, pressured in so many ways, questioning yourself, not having anyone to ally with, especially in an area of yes, let's follow this up, let's see what's going on, and at the same time, I've seen this all over the world. You want to provide for your family, so you have a paycheck, and you can reason and justify, and I don't even mean that out of any sense of you're trying to do the wrong thing. You're just believing what people are saying. You're believing that this wouldn't knowingly be put in the world to cause harm. Like, there's so many different layers to this. That's why I want to just emphasize it, because I don't want people to say flippantly, 3M's bad, Monsanto's bad. Well, you can
go ahead and say those things.
Yeah. Some of those practices 1,000,000% are bad. And you could make arguments that there's not a lot of good in some of those things. But I guess my point is that there's good people within those organizations trying to do the right thing, and often met with just huge pushback and very little leverage. And it's these conversations that I think are super important to have, so that we can use alternative medias to get out this information that is not getting out otherwise. And I'm proud of you for sharing it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there's a playbook about how science is conducted, but then there's, something that's maybe even more subtle than a playbook that's at work inside the institution. And, it's intimidation, and it's the way that you're treated. I did eventually have the opportunity to take what I had found to the CEO of 3M. And, at this point, at that time that I had that opportunity, we'd found 15 fluorochemicals in the blood of the general population. We had an idea where it was coming from. We knew it was widespread in the environment, so we had things to say about that. But I now really feel like that meeting, which I went into as a naive, 29-year-old, that was going to be an opportunity for me to share data. And really, I think what it was set up was a means to intimidate me and to say, stop. If you want to have any kind of a career at this company, stop doing, stop talking, just move on. So that's not the kind of stuff that you hear about unless you're inside and you're part of it. And it's not an easy story to tell. And you put a lot on the line personally if you decide to tell it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, wow. So you had this quote unquote conversation with the CEO. That can't feel good. Like, where do you go from there? Where do you go with this mountain of information that you personally and with your team cultivated? Where do you go from here then?
Yeah. And like I said, that meeting, I went into it somewhat hopeful, and I left feeling very, not only unheard, but attacked. So it was about a year after that meeting that 3M made an announcement that they were getting out of the C8 fluorochemical business, which I still believe that the long chain PFAS compounds are some of the worst. And so for me, that was a huge victory that they were making that decision to stop manufacturing those things. By the same token, I felt like I had paid a huge price personally in terms of my career to some degree, but my personal health and well-being, more to the point, just living in that environment of constant harassment and intimidation and, stress for so many years. So once 3M made that announcement public, I'd had enough. I couldn't take anymore. And so I left the environmental lab after that to have a more normal, what I hoped would be a more normal career at 3M.
So what do you do then? Where did you go from there, and how do you? Because now we cut to it's 2024. The New Yorker does a thing. So you're sitting with a lot of information. What do you like? How do you process that, and what did you do with that to this point?
Once I left the environmental lab in 2001, I buried it. Honestly, I just sort of packaged it all up and I tucked it away in the back of my mind, and I didn't think about it. I didn't talk about it. At some point years later, there was a growing controversy in my own community because 3M's contamination of the water supply around my community started to come to light. And even then, I didn't engage at all. And I still held on to that belief that the fluorochemicals were not toxic. And although I was really disappointed with how the company had handled things, that they had known about it for so long, I didn't engage. I didn't engage until, in 2021, when I sort of, a friend sent me the clip that John Oliver, of all people, did on PFAS and fluorochemicals. And I watched that clip. He's a funny guy, sarcastic, but it made me mad because I thought he was providing misinformation, because he was talking about the toxicity. He was talking about how they mess with the immune system and keep vaccines from working in young children. He talked about heart disease that's caused by these. He talked about the fact that they're carcinogens. And I was just like, no, it's none of those things. They're not toxic. But I went and looked in the technical literature because I was mad that he was sharing misinformation, and I learned that he was right. he was right in all of those things, that there had been a lot of really good science that had been done in the, nearly 20 years that I had backed out of the conversation that showed that these were toxic, that they were causing health effects, especially in sensitive populations. And that was a big moment for me, as well as discovering the archive of 3M documents that were made public as a result of litigation between the state of Minnesota and 3M. And through those documents, I could go back and see people that I had worked with side by side in the 90s who clearly had been involved since the 70s and 80s. And they never let on to me, people that I worked with, people that I trusted. So both on a personal level and on, a global citizen level, those documents and that tox data just were really motivating to me. And it wasn't until then that I unpacked all of that stuff that I had tucked away in the back of my mind for 20 years.
Jesus. What was the tox data? Was there one particular paper or data set that you just were like, yep, this was well done, this proves it? Like, was there a light bulb, or was it just like one after another? You were just kind of like, because I'm feeling what that must have felt like, and that had to be like almost blood leaving your body kind of moment, going, holy shit, because you were finding this stuff, not realizing the toxicology behind it, right?
Yeah. And there had been, a lot of, they're called the C8 studies that had been done really around a DuPont plant, but it was the same chemicals. And that was one of the most extensive studies of human health that has ever been done. And they found some significant findings, again, related to cancer, related to high cholesterol, related to low birth weight in children, hypertension, particularly during pregnancy. And like you said, it did lead me down a rabbit hole. And of course, I noticed how often the effects ended up targeting pregnant women and small children, right? The fact that the fluorochemicals can suppress the immune system of little children. When we're trying to vaccinate them against everything that's going on, and there's these chemicals now that they have in their bodies since before they were born that are challenging their body's ability to fight against all of the crazy things that happen in this world. So it was very affecting reading all of those papers and realizing the health effects of these compounds and on populations that never, ever would have been studied when 3M was looking at workers, mostly male, middle-aged workers in a fluorochemical facility.
Wow. I mean, and then just to emphasize again, this forever bioaccumulative nature of this thing. So I think this strange thing, the first conversation we had when you said, we were talking about like, there's a lot of different ways, and I've been in the health detoxification world and for a long time, and heavy metals, there's always a way to kind of chelate those out, and there's set and parabens and phthalates, there's half-lives in the body, and there's ways to kind of move through some of that stuff as long as you kind of stop the application of some of these things. But then when you get to these substances, we don't know of any way, right? And then you said something that alarmed me, that you found out in one of the only ways that the body can get rid of that, and that is through the breast milk, right? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So pregnancy, that's the other way. Pregnancy and breast milk. So because these compounds, they bind to proteins, some of the environmental pollutants that you hear about, like PCBs, they tend to accumulate in the fat. But but these things go in the proteins. And so when someone is pregnant, they're sharing the fluorochemicals in their blood with the developing fetus. And then also, like you say, in the breast milk once the baby is born. And again, that's, probably something that should have been known even without testing it a long time ago, given the structure of the molecule, that it would come out in breast milk, that it would pass through the placental barrier. But of course, there's plenty of studies now that demonstrate that is the case. Children are born with fluorochemicals in their blood now. In the United States, most of them are born that way. So it's interesting as you try to suss out the health effects, right? Because kind of where the story started in saying that there wasn't a clean control to do that analysis. Well, none of us are clean controls. So if you want to look at the effect of fluorochemicals, you can't do it against a clean population because we all have some in our bodies at this point.
So it's even hard to study it because you have no control and you have no living control. Like the fact that you are just randomly testing mice and realize they're high concentrations, you're like, and so therein lies just the global. I mean, the fact that the globe has been affected in every far off place is just so, it just gets it gets me to kind of realize that we can flippantly say that we're just humans, how can we affect the globe? Well, that's a perfect example.
Yeah, maybe not the way we want to affect the globe, but you're absolutely right.
It's the perfect worst example of what we've done to this planet. And so now, like, holy shit, right? What is your optimism now? And what can we do? Clearly we can know where this stuff is, know where it is on, and avoid as much as possible to continue to accumulate to the best of our ability, right? So that's number one. Where does your optimism come from? What's your mission? And where do you think we can go from here?
So my optimism comes from a couple of places, and one of those is science. 3M got out of the C8 PFAS business in 2002, and in the US, other C8 chemicals were outlawed in, I think, 2009. And since that time, the concentration of those specific chemicals, and that's only 2 out of the 10,000 that you said, they have come down measurably in the blood of the general population. And I think that data actually is a very useful map for what do we do. Like you say, avoid, but that's hard to do. It's in eggs, it's in meat, it's in fish, it's in groundwater, it's in milk, it's in rain, it's in snow. And so if we really want to make a difference, we have to turn off the tap on these compounds and keep them from getting into the environment in the first place. And, that means legislation. That means talking to your representatives and asking for laws that are as strict as we have in Minnesota now. California is another progressive state, Maine. They all have good legislation that has been passed that is going to, in the next few years, outlaw the addition of fluorochemicals to consumer products. And that's, I think, a very, very important step. I also think the EPA, in recently putting out ground or drinking water standards for a small handful of these compounds, but even in doing that, it's really raised people's awareness. And so drinking water providers around the US are having their water tested and finding out that they have fluorochemical contamination. And while that's a bad thing, the knowledge is a good thing, right? Because they can tell their constituents all right, we have a contamination problem and we need to solve it. And that's raising people's awareness. And ultimately, I think that is going to put pressure on the companies and the industry organizations to stop manufacturing these compounds. So if I know they're in my drinking water, and I know that my water bill is going to double because now I am going to have to, support the water company in getting rid of them, that makes me mad on a lot of levels, both that I'm raising my children on contaminated water and that I personally am paying for the irresponsibility of a corporation like 3M that's contaminated the groundwater. Why should I have to pay for that? And so I think that EPA drinking water standard has done a lot to raise awareness, and I hope it continues to, and people will push their governments, whether it's city government or state government, to do more testing and to put pressure on these corporations that put the compounds into the water in the first place to pay to get them out.
Yeah, that brings a big question of this life tax of products, right? Like, number one, that's saying that shit is already out there in there. There should be a responsibility. Number two, we have to shut off that faucet, right? And you could say plastics, you could say all of this stuff, but the problem is performance. The problem is it's good at its job. The problem is scalability of a solution. Like these kinds of things are such a wrestle. And we also the delusion that governments have as much control as they have when corporations have so much more these days, and the script has been flipped because of the power force and money force behind everything. But I do know that these conversations and the mass population understanding these things is a pressure that's well used, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of easy solutions, I really hope that you back this up too, that distillation, filter, reverse osmosis, things people can do in their own house to minimize the PFAS, because we've got, I think municipalities have about half of it's probably even more, but they say about 48% of the mm-hmm. U.S. population is being exposed to PFAS just by their on tap, on demand water. What do you think about filtering, and what have you seen as effective?
Yeah, you're right on. A reverse osmosis filtration system or a granulated active carbon filtration system, they won't get all of the fluorochemicals out, but I think they get the ones that are maybe the worst, the ones we know the most about. It's a good solution, especially if you can be the kind of consumer that's going to care for that filter the way that it needs to be, which is to say, you probably have to change it out every 6 months. You can't just put it on and forget about it, or it'll start adding those compounds right back into your drinking water. Right. And really that's what, the water facilities, they're going to build a giant reverse osmosis filtration system or a giant granulated activated carbon filtration system. So you can put one in your home now, and that definitely helps. And as you said, you can be a smart consumer and look for these compounds. You shouldn't have to, right? You shouldn't have to screen products that are on the shelves in the store for toxins, but you do. Your makeup, your sunscreen, your cookware, all of that, you gotta check for that now.
Yeah, it's crazy. I spend a lot of time vetting companies and trying to provide a solution, and man, I have pulled apart companies to the best of my ability, and you still find nanoparticulates and them not kind of greenwashing, and it's so freaking tricky.
Yeah.
And then you got to do there's some good third party testing that's going after some of these things and truly does it truly have PFAS on it? Yes or no? Does it have phthalates? Yes or no? Does it have in clothing? Does it have formaldehyde? Yes or no? So it's these kinds of things. And this is the same game.
Yeah.
It's the same game throughout all of these industries. And it's like, how is a normal person working their ass off, having a family, raising kids, how the hell, right? And that's where we just have to do the best we can. You got to get a filter. You got to do things to minimize exposure. And I think I mentioned this to you last time, that I have a very good friend of mine who was in the he started a company originally creating alternatives at scale to plastic, and was working with all the big boys. And then now he's pivoted and found a company doing packaging. But he's also got an IP for an algae-based, performance-based alternative to PFAS, non-toxic. And so he's getting money. He's been testing with McDonald's and all the big boys, and the price is the same or even better.
Mm-hmm.
So I say that to say that there are and can be solutions, science-based, science-backed, at scale. And I think that's also hopeful, because it's to know that it helps me personally when I'm talking with companies, and I'm talking with Paul Hawken, who's doing a lot of sustainable stuff with some of the biggest companies in the world. He gives me hope by telling me information that maybe isn't public, so that we can kind of lightly say, hey, man, do your best in this world and know that there's a lot of change that is happening. And I think, and just hearing what Minnesota's doing, and now the bans, and then hopefully California follows with all of those, and Maine, and then that literal wave happens, and we turn off that faucet totally. And then we really environmentally have to work to that, and probably simultaneously work to clean this place up a bit, right? We have to clean up our water. We have to clean up this environment probably for the rest of our lives. And hopefully we can find ways to disassociate and make inert this very dangerous compound. But yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing, just this whole story.
Yeah. And like you, I try to, kind of end on a positive note and say that there is legislation, and, the EPA has finally done something. And these are things that we should celebrate, and people's growing awareness and education and interest. These are things to celebrate and to keep growing all of those things, and we can make a difference.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What's your next wave of impact?
Well, I've, obviously I'm kind of cut my ties with 3M. So I'm doing consulting now, which means I'm working with cities that are trying to make sense out of the EPA's new regulations. What does it mean? What do they have to do? With smaller companies that maybe didn't even realize they had fluorochemicals in their product, and now they find out that they do, and how do they replace them? They want to make the right choices. And I'm also hoping to continue to grow as a speaker, so that I can work with young people who are getting into science and make them aware of some of the things that we've talked about: the playbook, the undone science, the unseen science, the intimidation. Prepare them to say, if you go into this world of American industry, you're probably going to see these things, and you got to be looking for them, and then you got to speak up about them. You got to not be silent. And I feel passionate about the idea that education is another way to make a difference. And I think, I know a lot of people that are entering the workforce right now that really want to have jobs where they can feel good about what they're doing and they make a difference. And so looking for avenues to continue to work with and influence that next generation.
I love that. I actually just reminded me, I'm speaking at a high school reunion next month, I think. And So I'm coming back to Minnesota. So if I have time, I'd love to connect and say
Yeah,
hi
absolutely.
in person. And that sounds great. And where can people find you? I know that you're limited on your social, but
Yeah.
you have a
I do
few
have a
places.
website. It's
Nice.
savannahsci.com. And I've got a blog there, as well as kind of links to the articles that we've talked about today and other things like that. So happy to have people reach out.
Right on. We'll put that in the show notes for sure. And Kris, I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for the work that you've done and all of the arrows that you've taken. And I'm grateful that you've transmuted that towards a positive, change. And it's such a pleasure. And thanks for sharing your story with everyone here.
Well, thank you for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks.